This is a video of my talk, The Evolution of Swift, Are We There Yet? When you hear the phrase, are we there yet, it's common to think of kids in the back seat of a car in a long car journey. They start asking, are we there yet? About 10 minutes after you leave the house, and continue to ask every 5 minutes until you reach your destination. Are we there yet? 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 But when we ask, is Swift there? We have to look a little bit at the journey it's been on and where its evolution's really going. I divide Swift's history into three broad epochs. First, ancient Swift. Swift 1.0 through to 2.2. We were innocent back then, just happy to have generics, tuples, type inference, and way fewer square brackets. Then there's the third epoch, the modern Swift epoch, Swift 4.0 through to 5.1. The kind of Swift I hope you are all writing today. Of course, in between the first and third epoch lies the second epoch, also known as Swift 3. So in this talk, I want to walk through the effect on Swift of Swift evolution, how it shaped our language through community input. We'll talk about what's gone well and what's gone less well, and what still needs to change if Swift's to remain a modern, dominant language. Okay, we're going to start off by looking at the ancient Swift epoch. If you've been using the language since day one, this might bring back some happy memories. If you haven't, this is probably more of a history lesson. We first met Swift at WWDC 14 alongside macOS Yosemite and iOS 8. Apple gave up 10 whole minutes of their keynote to talk specifically about programming. And you might say, what, only 10 minutes to revolutionize coding? We had generics, we had type inference. Well, keep in mind that keynote went out to millions of people, most of whom were not developers, and so words like closures or generics wouldn't have made much sense. But for us developers, it was a big surprise. Objective-C had been improving steadily in previous years, so it looked like its fortunes were reviving. It had a long future ahead of it. But this ancient, prehistoric Swift from 2014 was very different from the Swift we have today. Many things we consider to be standard Swift weren't even invented. Things like guard, or @available, or protocol extensions, or codable, or even sets. We had to use NSSet like animals. But we could write code like this. C-style for loops with a prefix decrement operator. In fact, if you look at Swift 1.0 code, and I still actually have some, it looks like nothing we would write today. Of course, Apple knew it was going to change and evolve. This was taken from the platform State of the Union in 2014. Look at the small text in the corner down there. Source converters will be provided as required. Even back then, way before evolution, Apple were acting on feedback. Here's one of my earliest Swift radars from June 11th, 2014. I feel very guilty filing radars for Swift. They've done such a good job, if only the weirdness was less weird. That code, by the way, is this. Let A equals an array of 1, 2, 3. Let B equals A0 equals 5, yes, modifying a constant array, and then printing A would print 5, 2, 3. That would work. More confusingly, print B would also print 5, 2, 3, which is unimaginable today. Then we have code like this. var C equals 1, 2, 3, var D equals C, C.append 4, print C, 1, 2, 3, 4, print D, 1, 2, 3. So it would copy sometimes and not other times. It was weird and inconsistently weird. But even then, that early version showed the promise of what was to come. We finally had a language that was part OOP and part functional. We finally had things like map, which allowed us to take arrays of strings like this, camping, parking, weekend, and translate them into French in just one line of code. Shortly after, we had Swift 1.2, the first major version of Swift in April 2015, giving us zip and flat map and finally sets and a way to collapse the if-let pyramid. And in June we had Swift 2.0 beta announced with some real landmark features. Things like try-catch finally arrived, guard, defer, and @available. But as important as they were small compared to what Apple announced next. They were going to open source Swift by the end of the year. And on December the 3rd, they did it. including Linux. And they made some really bold statements on their website. They said Swift was going to be the new universal language, and anyone with a good idea can help shape the future features and direction of that language. And their goal was to create the best available language for uses ranging from systems programming to mobile and desktop apps, scaling up to cloud services. 11 days later, C-style for loops died thanks to Erica Shadun's first submission to Swift Evolution. The first of many, I should say. Erica has actually submitted more proposals than anyone else, including anyone from Apple, or in her words, she's had more language proposals outright rejected than any other person in the community. But her initial proposals soon turned into many proposals. And more, and more, and more. They kept coming across a variety of topics from a range of people. And the result of all that change was Swift 3. A refreshed language that made a clean break from Objective-C. Almost every API changed, and in fact, 96 Swift evolution proposals were implemented in Swift 3. As Erica herself said, the move to Swift 3 isn't just going to be disruptive, it's going to be traumatic. Swift 3 just doesn't have enough time or scope to be perfected. And she was right, even though to be fair, she had authored quite a few of those changes herself. Now in retrospect, I think we should all be glad Swift was open source beforehand. You know, if Apple had announced all those changes as a surprise dub-dub keynote, there would have been riots. Or at least would have raised massive questions about Swift's long-term viability. It's also no surprise then that Swift 3 was also when they first deferred ABI stability. It wasn't coming in 3, it would come in 4. And then it wasn't coming in 4, it would land in 5. Joe Groff, paraphrasing Shigeru Miyamoto, said this: "A late ABI is only late until it's finished, a bad ABI is bad forever." And even after cutting ABI stability, the number of changes introduced caused long-term problems for the Swift team at Apple. Here's Slava Pestov saying, "We are still paying off technical debt from rushed Swift 3 era changes." Rushed. It needed more time. When does Apple rush stuff? Remember that Erica quote? Swift 3 just doesn't have enough time or scope to be perfected? Now a sensible person might ask, what's the rush? Couldn't they just have held back Swift 3 by a month or 3 or 5 for extra discussion and polish? Well, at the time Apple tied its new iPhone releases to new iOS releases. And new iOS releases were tied to new Xcode releases. And new Xcode releases were attached to new Swift releases. And of course the iPhone is hugely important to Apple. If you look at the pie chart of their earnings, 62% comes from iPhone, 7% from iPad, 10% from Mac, 15% from services, and 6% other, probably dongles. But with the problems of Swift 3 also came a lot of important, long-lasting improvements. Swift 3 brought with it the great Swift API transformation, which is what made almost every line of code change. This was driven by the Swift API design guidelines, which were really precise, if a little bit focused on linguistics. But it meant we'd have shuffle and shuffled, with a D on the end, doing different things. We could tell from the name one was in place, one would return a new value. And Swift 3 really solidified many concepts of idiomatic Swift for the first time. It became its own language, Swifty. When we think of Swifty code, we're effectively thinking of Swift 3. And that brings us into the modern era of Swift. The Swift that if you learn from scratch today, realistically is the only Swift you know. By modern, I mean 4.0 through 5.1. And that might sound like a small amount of time compared to 1 through 3, but these were huge releases. In Swift 4, we got improved dictionaries and key paths and massive release of Codable. Then we had can import and conditional conformances and synthesized conformances in 4.1. In 4.2 we had case iterable, dynamic member lookup, the new randomness API and more. In 5.0 we had dynamic callable, raw strings, a result type and more. And in 5.1 we had stacks of huge improvements that made Swift UI possible. The first time in a long time a language has changed specifically to support a framework. And even with all those changes, they still managed to achieve ABI stability in Swift 5.0 and module stability in Swift 5.1. Now how could they achieve all those changes while also getting ABI stable and without repeating the problems of Swift 3. Well, 3 important things changed in order to make that possible. First, Apple finally broke the link between major iOS releases and Swift versions. Swift 4.2 shipped with iOS 12. It meant they had 9 months more to work on Swift 5 to make sure it was right. Second, there was a policy change on August 8, 2018. This is Ted Kremenek, who runs the Swift project at Apple, saying, before a pull request for an evolution proposal will be accepted, an implementation must be in hand for a proposal as part of the review. Now that might seem at odds with their announcement for evolution. Anyone with a good idea can help shape the future features and direction of the language. After all, significantly fewer folks have the knowledge or ability to contribute to Swift than can have ideas about contributing, particularly because large parts of Swift are written in C++ and Python. However, it did stop the situation where some proposals were coming in that were extremely hard to implement. This one here, SE0068, was from April 2016 and was implemented only finally in Swift 5.1. Even then, it was fixed with a cheeky implementation that caught the error message and replaced it with a synonym for type of self. You see, the goal here was not to be exclusionary. What they want is to demonstrate your idea is possible. They might rewrite your code completely, but if the idea is sound, that's what matters. The third change is on January 19th, 2018, switching to forums rather than mailing lists. This made it easier to join discussions and to follow long threads. Now that has of course led to the bike shedding the Swift forums are famous for. If you aren't familiar with the word bike shedding, it's the idea that if you get a group of folks together and say, hey, let's design a power station, they'll spend most of their time deciding how the bike shed should look, because it's much easier to discuss. As a famous military saying, the worst plan is no plan, the second worst plan is 2 plans. It's often the case that Swift Evolution has 10 plans. And when that works, it works really well. For example, someone put forward the idea of adding 2 properties to binary integer. Is it even or is it odd? As it worked through the forums, folks realized that is multiple of as a method would be a great addition as well. And what actually happened was, the final implementation was only is multiple of, because it covered is even and is odd perfectly well. However, sometimes the discussions can be negative. And sometimes they can be very negative. And when it's done politely and helpfully, being negative is okay. You're explaining why something might hit problems or how it's been used elsewhere. This helps everyone learn and helps everyone improve. But occasionally things even go beyond negative and into destructive. Here's Erica again talking about a proposal to add a toggle method to booleans. She said, I'm concerned by some uncollegial reactions to its acceptance, which seem to boil down to, this is too trivial a change to the language, stated through sarcasm and ad hominem attacks, on Twitter, on the Evolution forums, and even a mean-spirited GitHub repository. I'd like to think that everyone listening to this can agree collectively this is shameful behaviour. We are better than this. And honestly, we're lucky it was Chris Eidhoff who put this proposal through. He's extremely well established in our community and respected. He was able to battle his way through these attacks and get it through. So we've gone from Swift's launch at dub 14 to the open sourcing of Swift 2.0 at dub 15, then Evolution launching, and then branch out to the forums, the huge release of Swift 4.2 with randomness and more. And in fact, recently we passed the 250th Evolution proposal to add a Swift style guide. At the time, of course, most folks had no idea why Swift would need a style guide, but then shortly afterwards, Apple announced Xcode 11, which, by the way, SwiftUI now will generate Swift code for you as you work. Well, that's where you need a Swift style guide. So we've had over 2 years of Evolution now, and about 2 Evolution proposals every week. Almost anyone can get involved somehow. Unless, of course, you have thoughts about access control, in which case maybe check out Rust. And we have enough history now to be able to see what's gone well along the way. First, Swift Evolution is definitely a community effort. It's not just about Apple. Folks from around the world are involved, and it's not an accident. The Swift team at Apple have worked extremely hard to encourage everyone to take part, no matter what their experience level. If you don't believe me, here's Harlan Haskins, who worked at Apple. He made, by the way, hash warning and hash error. He worked on Swift syntax and more. He's one of the nicest folks to ever meet, and here he is on Twitter saying, "Hi everyone, my DM's are open and I'd love to help with Swift, whether writing apps or contributing to the compiler, also compilers or LLVM." Second, the team works super hard to find starter bugs so anyone can help build Swift regardless of their experience levels. These are specifically called starter bugs and they come up regularly. You can just go to bit.ly/starterbugs to go straight there. And talk to Harlan, ask for his help to get started. Third, the comprehensive review and discussion means we can have confidence we're seeing best of breed features delivered into the language. Here's the pitch of raw strings, for example. It went through originally as a pitch, became SE200, was returned for review, had a second pitch on the forums, then a bike shedding thread to have more and more discussion. Things happen in a really clear, meaningful way that drives the language forward with a purpose. In fact, Greg Hyo, who works on the Photos team at Apple, said this: "The alternatives considered section is often my favourite part to read in SE proposals. Clear reasoning, pros and cons, and general thoughtfulness. Because all aspects get considered. Prior art in other languages is evaluated, which helps fend off repeated discussion in the forums. Fourth, I think the review process is proving fair. The Swift core team takes every proposal on its own merits. There's no appeal to authority or special treatment for certain people. For example, here is the bang bang operator, unwrap or die, pitched by some major folks here, Ben Cohen, Dave Long, Paul Cantrell, and Erica Sedun. And here it is rejected, with the reasoning being it might make people think they were try ! Or as ! Or here's SE56 to allow trailing closures and guard conditions from Chris Latner, the person who started Swift originally inside Apple. And this was rejected, even though if you scan down the document it says, actually, from a historical perspective, the current situation was an oversight. It doesn't matter, it's part of the language now. Fifth, we've seen a real blossoming of server-side development, plus things like dynamic member lookup and dynamic callable in Swift 4.2 and 5.0, giving us Python support and more. Heck, it even runs on Windows these days. Swift is finally coming close to its goal of being a multi-purpose language that runs everywhere. So those are all things I think have gone very well. But what's gone not so well? And honestly, it's important we discuss these things too if we're going to do better as a community. Ash Furrow posted this picture of a modified Swift logo, like a Rick and Morty mashup, because he's found repeatedly the rate of change in Swift can be hard to keep up with. And it's certainly true, sometimes we prefer fewer new features and more fundamentals like compiling faster. Going back to Slava Pestov again, the Swift team are aware of it. Here he is saying, I still feel 90% of Swift users do not care much for Swift evolution and would rather have better tooling. And they are working hard to improve that situation. It's a massive priority for them. Second, lots of people are unwilling or unable to get involved. They feel decisions are being made over there somewhere else, and they just wait to see what comes out of the Swift forum sausage factory. So from that perspective, it's really easy to feel like Swift evolution is basically out to get your project, that no matter how fast you update, there are still more changes coming. There is one massive mitigation here. We're lucky to have Swift Weekly Brief, run by Baz Burke and Kristaps Grinzberg. It's really important to recognise the work of volunteers like this who do so much to build awareness of Swift's changes. And third, we're now at the point where Swift is such an advanced language, it can be hard to see how various parts interact without extensive testing. For example, Suresh Khan, of Coordinators fame, put through a proposal for a count where method. Give it a sequence and a predicate, and it will return how many items in the sequence match the predicate. On August 6, 2018, it went to review. On the 15th, it was accepted. On September the 14th, it was implemented in Swift. But on March the 3rd of 2019, it went back to being accepted again. And the reason was code like this. Partially applied functions can have their argument labels omitted. So in this code, the compiler can't easily tell whether using the count property or the count method, which makes compilation slower. And of course, at this point, that's the last thing they want. Of course, the real question is, are we there yet? Andrew Madsen from the Lambda School did a test how many apps use Swift in 2019. And this was as simple as downloading the top 110 free apps from the App Store, looking through to see how much Swift they use. This is not scientific in any way. They could have used entirely Swift or just a few lines of Swift. All we know is there's some Swift in there somewhere. And its answer was 57% of apps use Swift. And we're seeing some major features finally happen. We got the result type in Swift 5.0. Swift 5.1 gave us module stability. I'm hoping to see async await start appearing on the radar at some point. And my personal favourite, regular expressions, well, I'm not quite sure where they'll go, although I should say raw strings in Swift 5.0 do help substantially. But we don't really know what's coming up. There's no longer term plan being discussed. Here's how Rust handles forward planning. There's a public roadmap that gets merged into a bigger plan for the year. And actually Microsoft did something similar for C# 8. I said earlier that we're now past 250 Swift evolution proposals, and the 250th proposal was to adopt a fixed set of code style guidelines. Now for many people, there's a book by Erica Sedun called Swift Style. This is the de facto style guide for us. It goes way further than SE 250, and it's highly recommended. And then there's the core team. As you can see, almost everyone there works at Apple, with the only person not Apple is Chris Lattner, who's ex-Apple. And they had promised to appoint folks from a much more diverse background. I know for a fact Apple really want to do better here, and I feel confident we'll see change soon. Because I want to see everyone feeling welcome in our community, and I'd love for Apple to be at the centre of that. Okay, let's wrap up. I think we've come a long way in only a handful of years. The early Swift code I showed you near the beginning is genuinely unimaginable today, and that's awesome. We survived the massive change of Swift 3 and came out stronger. Yes, it was a painful process, traumatic as Erica said, but it gave the language firm foundations to build on. Plus, we finally reached ABI stability and module stability. As a result, we can expect big companies to switch more easily, not least Apple. I'm expecting a massive pivot from this year onwards, Swift UI and CryptoKit just being the first of many new frameworks designed for Swift. And we're even figuring out the Swift forums. It's easier than ever to get involved at some level. To quote Erica one last time, just filing a bug report is joining in, whether it's for a feature you want in a language or a performance issue or whatever. Of course, that doesn't mean our work is done and we can go off somewhere to relax. You know, I have no idea if Swift will ever reach the lofty goals was set when Swift.org launched. Will it be the best available language for all these kinds of varied uses? But I do know that the story of Swift evolution is one of people working together to solve common problems. And I want to be part of that. And I want you to be part of that too. Because if we want to have a community that encourages fresh ideas, that is welcoming to folks with those fresh ideas, and is diverse and inclusive, then we all have a role to play. Thank you very much.